really need to develop those clusters and to sort of grow them, but we're at a point where we can do it across the country. The other thing, this is sort of an aside, not too much in line with previous remarks, but we do have a ton of materials around communications and planning for data breaches and that type of thing that we've shared with a number of our friends on the SLDS side. But if any of that type of information is useful, we're happy to share that. It's sort of geared specifically to our work, but a lot of the SLDS folks have said, oh, you know, this communication stuff, it's applicable to what we're doing. So we're certainly happy to share that with anyone who has any interest.
That's great. Anybody have any questions for clarification right now? Yes.
Some of you may have heard a little bit about this study that I'm going to talk about before, because I did give some insights into what we were doing at NASWA at a prior meeting that some of you attended. But I'm going to provide some findings from a national scan as well as 2 state site visits that we conducted. And I want to point out that Wayne Gordon, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Employment and Training Administration at DOL, is here. And several years ago, he mentioned to me that it would be useful to document what the research capacity is in state workforce agencies. Such an effort would help states share practices and lessons learned, but could also help direct DOL's technical assistance and support. So thanks to a TA grant that grew out of WIOA, NASWA has just completed the effort and thrown it over the transom to folks at the Department of Labor, and hopefully we'll be able to disseminate it very soon. From NASWA's perspective, the other benefit is that getting a baseline of where states are, state workforce agencies, is helpful to kind of setting expectations under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, because there are requirements related to research and evaluation in the Act. The research team included me, Steve Wanner, who's a fellow at the Urban Institute and also used to be at the Department of Labor, and Kevin Nod, who's a staff assistant and policy analyst at NASWA, and he was the research assistant on the project, and he's here. Most importantly, the partners were the 41 state agencies, state workforce agencies, who took a lot of time completing an inventory for us, providing information on their research output, their skills, staff skills, internal staff capacity, funding, and their research partners over a recent 5-year period between 2011 and 2015. And since a major goal was to help provide states information on what other states are doing and how they're doing it, we did 2 site visits to the states of Ohio and Washington that are among a minority of states that have substantial research capacity. Other states are in this room, Indiana, Mississippi. There are a handful of other states that seem to have a lot of capacity as well, but we had the money to go to 2 states and chose Ohio and Washington. And we documented the role that several of their state entities have played in developing and maintaining their longitudinal administrative data sets and in producing data analysis and research projects. And although their models differ, both states have a long history of using evidence to support policy development and have received critical funding support, buy-in from agency heads and state leaders, and have well-led high-capacity research teams. So there's a lot of intersection between what Patrick was saying and what we found on our site visits. Cynthia was an important partner in setting up and contributing to the Washington case study. So I'm just going to go through the major findings, and this is a very impressionistic national scan that I'm talking about, but I think they help give us a sense of kind of where the system is as a whole. The first question we asked was about demand. Kind of, you know, is there demand in your agency in your state for the kinds of information that workforce agency research and evaluations can yield? And every state said yes, and that was basically to provide the follow-up question of, well, what are those types of questions? So we did gather them and put them into 5 main categories. And Kevin is going to pass around a table that has examples of the types of questions that states gave us. They could list up to 7 questions, each of them, and the 5 categories they fell into were kind of understanding customers and their barriers, improving program administration, understanding labor markets, measuring program performance and outcomes, and measuring program impact and effectiveness. So once we had the sense of what some of those questions were, we had a series of questions related to what their capacity to actually do that is. And the first thing we asked was about their organizational structure. And a large number of the agencies, 3/4 of them, say they have at least one unit in the agency that initiates and advances research and evaluation, or is responsible for doing so. And 80% of them reported that they partner with or rely on outside contractors or researchers to help move research and evaluation efforts forward. We collected information on all of the internal research units as well as the outside partners, and that's actually going to be in the report. It is in the report. So that you can, if you're looking to see what other states who they might be relying on for outside partners, you can see it in the report and follow up if you're interested. Findings on staff capacity, funding, and research output were less encouraging than the fact that they had units in their agencies. The capacity varies tremendously across the states. Some states produce a large number of research products, but half the states reported producing 3 or fewer in-house research and evaluation studies over the 5-year period that we looked at. And then looking at research that was conducted with outside contractors or partners, the median reported output was 2 research and evaluation products over the same time period. In establishing a baseline, it's also worth noting that only a small number of the agencies employed, either directly or through outside support, quasi-experimental or experimental research methods for 1 or more studies. And that's something that most people, when they think about evidence-based policymaking, tend to think about that level of analysis. To help create a database of recent research products, we asked the agencies to provide short summaries of their efforts or to provide us web links to places where their research is housed. So we collected all of that information, and that's also in the report, and will help hopefully states look over the fence to see what their neighbors are doing and maybe be able to pick up on some of the products that are already out there. We asked them to describe their current internal research staff capacity and made it clear that term encompassed more than just staffing levels, but also experience and research skills. And 2/3 of the agencies reported that their staff capacity is either inadequate or fair. 30% reported that their capacity is adequate, and the remaining 5 states were at either end of the spectrum, like very adequate or non-existent. And then we collected information on the research skill areas for which agencies report having sufficient capacity or the opposite, needing assistance or help with capacity development. And Kevin, we have another table that I'll pass around. Oh, you already did? Okay, great. You can review it later, but we came up with 15 research skill areas, and a minority of agencies ranging from 10 to 44% reported having sufficient capacity across those 15 skill areas. And 40% and up to 78% reported that they would like help, technical assistance, or capacity development with respect to those areas. Again, focusing on the 2 research skill areas that are most associated with evidence-based policymaking, quasi-experimental research methods and experimental research methods. Only a handful of the reporting agencies said that they had employed those methods, either directly or through with outside help over that 5-year period. 14 states, I think, was the total. And then I thought it was also interesting that 80% of the states said that they would like more capacity conducting research with qualitative methods. That was actually the highest, that was the research area, skill area for which the largest number of states said they would like more assistance. We asked them to estimate their 2015 spending on research and evaluation, and half the states reported spending $100,000 or less. There's more information and more details in the report. An important source of funding for many of the states was the Workforce Data Quality Initiative grants. Obviously, some states haven't received those, and for others, they've exhausted their funds. And a few more data points. Almost 30% of the agencies considered their research and evaluation funding adequate, so a majority consider it inadequate. So the point of that question was, well, what are the consequences, do you feel like, in your state if you feel like funding is inadequate. So we collected comments on that, and just a few of the examples. For one state, the system is less able to anticipate changes in trends and therefore remains reactionary. It reduces the ability to fulfill requests and for customers to make timely, data-driven decisions. Another one, the extent of our research is limited by resources available. More resources would probably lead to more analysis, more innovation, and more robust evidence-based decision-making. So none of that's a surprise to those of you gathered here, but I think sometimes it's important to document the obvious so that it's something that other people can be let in on. So anyway, looking across all of the state workforce agency responses regarding both staff capacity, funding, and research output over this period, it seems that about a third of the agencies appear to have adequate or fair staff capacity and funding and fairly active data development and research efforts, and that there are a lot of states that would really like to make a big push and could benefit from the examples of you and others on how to do that. In terms of insights, I saw the movie Hidden Figures last night, which is a...
If you haven't seen it, you have to go see it. It is so good, especially if you have daughters or you have friends who have daughters.
So one thing I'd like to affirm is that to the extent that any of this that you're doing is rocket science, the one thing is it's been done before. So you're not having to discover that formula that takes you on that trajectory to get to where you want to be. And we know something about who is out there doing it. They're not hidden figures. So that's a great starting position to be in. Even states without a long history of relying on research to inform policy, like Ohio and Washington, can rely on the practices and lessons learned from those states. Separate from that, though, the Wdqi funding and the SLDS funding was really critical to boosting forward the programs in Washington and Ohio, so I'm not going to deny the fact that that was really important, and that there are going to be a lot of states that without that kind of seed funding and support are going to struggle, whether it comes from those grants or from other funding sources. And then to get at the value of something like Wdqi, the other point that we've made in the paper in terms of insights is that beyond peer-to-peer sharing and relying on technical assistance and funding support, the question of how to supplement and leverage individual state efforts is key. Even in many of the agencies that have great research capacity or greater research capacity, the output is not adequate to address all the important questions, and it's never going to be enough to ensure routine replication, which is increasingly seen as important for the more rigorous types of studies. So one approach would be to develop regional outposts, either in state agencies that have a lot of capacity or in other entities that do, that could support not only individual agency efforts or individual state efforts, but also cross-state research efforts and a national research agenda. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Cynthia, and she can provide some highlights of the types of information that you will find in the case studies that we've done on the states of Washington and Ohio. They're about 30 pages long and do speak to issues around data governance, relationship building, and things that Cynthia will say.
So she does the hard part. She has to talk about the whole study, and she did all the hard work, and I get to talk about like the fun little anecdote parts. Pulling from what Yvette was saying, that we in Washington have a culture and a history of using data to make decisions and to gauge performance of programs. And that's something that spans the governor's office, the legislature, going back decades. And so we're fortunate in that regard. But what I don't want to send the message is that, well, you're screwed if you haven't been doing this for 30 years, so you might as well forget about it. I'm so excited that Alabama's here and hearing about the efforts you guys are making. I think WIOA is a really great opportunity to be able to sell to your state and local partners that this is the reality. This is the way we're doing business. You need to be able to evaluate programs, and so exploit that as best you can as you're trying to have conversations in your states for those of you who are still having some struggles there. Relationships have proven critical, and even with the culture we've had in Washington, we spent about a year with the likely contributing partners to our state longitudinal data system. So that would include K-12, early learning, workforce, higher ed, community colleges,